Hi everyone, this is Rizwan here from Sustainable Factors. I'm an interim management consultant specializing in enterprise risk and sustainability reporting. In this presentation, I aim to walk you through an example of the TCFD Alignment Maturity Assessment. This is a comprehensive assessment which I've created to really help you measure and monitor the progress of your alignment to the TCFD recommendations. And ultimately, the assessment will help you with a sense of precision and confidence in your TCFD disclosures, and of course save on costs and time associated with the wider sustainability initiatives. So whilst it's not my intention to cover the whole TCFD recommendations in too much detail, it will still be necessary to introduce you to the TCFD framework to have everyone on the same page. So for those of you who are already familiar with the background, please do bear with me whilst I cover this from the start, because it is needed to build into the maturity assessment piece. I'll also try and timestamp this presentation for those with some familiarity to the TCFD who can then skip forward. And whilst going through the presentation, whilst going through the background, I will simultaneously explain some of the challenges that are emerging with the practical applications of the TCFD recommendations. And then ultimately I will illustrate an example of what that TCFD Alignment Maturity Assessment looks like. Now, in order to start with the background to the TCFD, we really have to frame the issue of climate change first. Over the past few decades, world leaders have started to really give climate change a lot more attention, as it's now visibly disrupting businesses with that unprecedented level of physical impacts. So, for example, the increased probability of our fence panels in the back garden for those to be blown down, that's one thing, right? But flooding or the destruction of your corporate real estate, that's a completely different game altogether. So the TCFD is an acronym. It stands for the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And they are just that. They are a task force comprised of 32 members. These are individual people, these 32 members, and they come in the form of expert advisors, data users, data preparers, and the vice chairs, who are typically executives from tier 1 large cap organizations. And then you have the chairman himself. And they all together, they comprise the 32 members. Now, the task force has been created by the Financial Stability Board, or the FSB, and they are an international body convened by the G20 countries. And their job is to monitor and make recommendations about the global financial system, particularly how to not mess it all up again like we did in 2008. So that's an interesting point there, right? We can understand why the FSB had to sharpen their agenda after the 2008 crash, but it's not really intuitive to understand what they have to do with climate change. So what have the task force done? Well, they've created a guidance framework to help businesses report on how they are aligned to the climate-related agenda. Now, please note here that they have produced a framework and they haven't produced a standard, okay? And I've seen it referred to as a standard, so that's why I raised this point. It is actually a framework. And whilst it's not a standard, your TCFD alignment status will still need to be disclosed as part of a standardized reporting process that's set by either legislation or, of course, regulatory bodies and so forth. Now, many organizations have been making disclosures about climate-related issues that are impacting their business. But over the last 7 years or so, the TCFD have enabled, or the TCFD's framework has enabled businesses to make their climate-related disclosures more effective. Therefore, the objective of these new mandatory drivers to align with the TCFD is really to create the necessary information efficiencies with regards to those climate-related impacts on the business. And on the business, that's the word being debated, or that's the term being debated at the moment, that we're talking about impacts on the business. So not to digress too much here, but that then begs the question, what about the business's impact on the planet itself or on nature itself? And as a side note, that framework is now being built by another task force called the TNFD, which stands for the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. But back to the point. So these information efficiencies regarding climate issues will then effectively inform the allocation of capital, because investors, insurers, and in fact your entire stakeholder community will require this effective information to help price risk. So investors, for example, they want to know how you are managing the climate-related issues that impact your business. And so the FSB created a task force to guide organizations to disclose their climate-related financial information with both accuracy and foresight. So the TCFD, they use various methods to enable you as an organization and help you deliver against its recommendations. And these methods can broadly be categorized into three main areas, like techniques, tools and capabilities, and of course, other frameworks and standards which can help you achieve the requirements of the TCFD. And I know this last category can make things somewhat confusing, so I'll come back to that in a moment. Starting with the techniques, one of the techniques used are actual direct instructions. Okay, these are instructions essentially set the scene in terms of what outputs and what outcomes are required by your organization. So you can use them, I guess, in program mandate meetings and project level kickoff meetings to help really bring that coalition across your business and nurture that initial coordination of interest levels, involvement from those internal and external stakeholders. So these instructions will ask you, for example, to describe a particular process and disclose how a particular process is adopted within your organization. So they're very output and outcome-led instructions. Now, as an extension to this, the TCFD will also request for you to describe and disclose against a particular key performance measure, such as time or achieving certain targets. So another technique is where the TCFD offer you a set of principles. Okay, so when preparing and coordinating your disclosures, there are a set of principles that enable your disclosures to be delivered in a controlled and consistent manner, and of course become more effective in how they are delivered. But the key technique that I want to focus on are the probing questions. Okay, these are probing questions that are designed to really get you thinking, so that the information you start to gather in that journey to answering those questions, that information will then be part of the core template which you will use to communicate your overarching management and understanding of the climate-related issues that are impacting the business. So probably worth noting that these probing questions have also formed the raw ingredients to the TCFD Alignment Maturity Assessment. So the good news here is that the assessment is directly hinged into the TCFD, and it won't be alien to your current efforts. Now, I won't really go into too much detail here with regards to tools and capabilities, but it's enough at this stage to say that, for example, scenario analysis is really the distinguishing feature of the TCFD's guidance. Scenario analysis fundamentally weaves through the core elements of the TCFD's guidance, particularly allowing you to gain some foresight. And it's actually this foresight, this forward-looking element that really distinguishes the TCFD framework, the TCFD's framework from the other frameworks out there, insofar as disclosing the potential impact of climate change into the financial position of the business. Then, of course, you have risk and opportunity impact matrices, which are they're actually conventional in-house tools that can be adapted so that they can be used as part of your overall enterprise risk management framework. And benchmarking. So benchmarking is a big presentation in itself, right? But I would really advise big organizations to start participating in benchmarking frameworks, particularly in the corporate real estate dimension, given its large proportional weight as both a business enabler, because you need corporate real estate in many of the large manufacturing businesses, for example, but your corporate real estate also contributes to your overall carbon emissions. So it's quite important to understand where you sit in comparison to the sector perspective. And climate modeling and ESG data is probably quite self-explanatory here. And finally, as I mentioned, there are other reporting and measurement frameworks and standards which when you participate in that framework, you will by default comply with some of the requirements of the TCFD. So much so that the CDP, in fact, they claim that by participating in their framework, you will go beyond the TCFD. And the CDP, along with the other incumbent frameworks like SASB, along with the IIRC and CDP, they've been consolidated into the ISSB. You have GRI. These are what we call the incumbent frameworks because they're the most prominent ones out there at the moment that are being used for across the reporting landscape. And these frameworks have mapped their probing questions and requirements to the probing questions and requirements of the TCFD. So if your approach has been to use an incumbent framework as your go-to source with an intention to then backfill the TCFD gaps, right? Because they're mandatory drivers to now use the TCFD. So if your approach has been to first look at the incumbent frameworks, then essentially say, all right, what's missing from the TCFD alignment? Then you probably want to regroup now and see where you are in terms of TCFD alignment maturity. So I'm going to be focusing on the techniques only, specifically the probing questions, because that's where the TCFD Alignment Maturity Assessment lives. The TCFD framework is essentially built on 4 core elements, or say 4 foundational pillars. I'll be using the words elements and pillars interchangeably somewhat through the presentation, or they're actually called themes in some cases as well. So the objective of these 4 core elements is to categorize the type of disclosures that you need to be reporting. So this is broken down into governance, which is information about who in the organization has oversight and responsibility in relation to climate-related issues. Then you have the pillar of strategy. And as you remember, I spoke about scenario analysis as a tool to enable the strategic position of the organization insofar as disclosing the actual impacts of climate change on the financial position of the business. Then you, of course, have risk management. Now the risk types have been categorized into transition risk and physical risk, but again, I won't be going down that route as for me, it will be out of scope for this particular presentation. Okay, but it's enough to say that the risk management pillar sets out the scene for you to disclose the processes and plans used by the organization to assess and manage climate-related risks. And then you have metrics and targets whereby you disclose the goals and the objectives of the organization, which should also include clear timelines. So what I've done now is I've laid out the 4 pillars here. And for the purpose of this presentation, I'll be drilling down into the governance pillar, and I won't really be talking about the other 3 pillars here, because the initial part of this presentation is just supposed to be a contextual background that builds up into the maturity assessment. Okay, so as you can see here, the governance pillar starts with its first instruction. So you remember that from those techniques, it starts with an instruction, or should I say a required outcome. Okay, in other words, they're telling you as a business to be in a position where you can disclose the organization's governance around climate-related risks and opportunities. The arrow then points down for you to offer 2 ways, A and B. They want you to offer 2 ways in which you can be in that position to disclose that required outcome. So again, not to digress here, but for those of you who are not experienced in program management, any program or transformation, when you aim to achieve an outcome, you have to first produce at least one or many outputs. So please stay aligned with that terminology, outcome and outputs. And in this case, there are 2 outputs that you need to achieve in order to be able to make those disclosures about climate governance. So the first one here is a description of the board's oversight of climate-related risks and opportunities. And the second one is a description of the management's role in assessing and managing climate-related risks and opportunities. So the idea here is when you start to produce such descriptions, you'll be creating those outputs that will deliver the required outcome. Now, the constraint here is when you ask someone a question, their answer will likely be subjective. In other words, it will be dependent on how they have interpreted your inquiry. Okay, you can't just now tell people to think objectively unless you have a corresponding framework that enforces this objectivity. And yes, the TCFD do direct the organization to use measurement frameworks to then enforce that objectivity, but it's not always the case across the reporting landscape. So any influence of subjectivity in those information flows would mean that stakeholders like asset owners or asset managers, they're going to then have to rationalize the data and information into their own proprietary models and then gap fill those data points through engagement sessions with your board and management teams. So to go around this inevitable issue of subjectivity, the TCFD offer a series of probing questions. And these probing questions, they really help create some boundaries in terms of the type of information you need to source across the business. And as you then go about answering these probing questions and generating that description of the board's oversight or that output, which the TCFD require, you'll be answering them with some kind of guided structure behind you. So here we can see 11 questions, and some of them actually, in fact, I think many of them follow on from the previous question. As you can see, for example, in question 2 here, in question 3, they're directly related to each other, as we can see question 4 and 5 as well, and so on. So let's look at the second output in terms of describing the management's role in assessing and managing climate-related risks and opportunities. And once again, we see 11 questions here, some of which again are closely related. And again, when you go about your investigations to answer these questions, you will have a pathway, albeit with a subjective bias to some degree. You know, you can't eradicate it totally at this stage, but you'll have a pathway to start populating your TCFD alignment disclosures. So take, for example, question 10 and 11 here, which says, how does information reach the management, and how often is this information passed on to management? So basically, they're asking you about the current processes and capabilities and frequency of execution. But now we see, again, practical issues begin to emerge, or should I say practical issues in how to apply the questions and answers, how to make them useful. So let's look at the practical issues in some more detail here. Firstly, how do we ensure that the answers to those questions that you've just elicited across the organization, how do we ensure that they have some quality control around it? Meaning, after investigations, are you now producing information which is relevant, reliable, specific, and so forth? Okay. Secondly, how can you even begin to answer these questions if your organization hasn't established effective and dedicated climate governance? Right? And thirdly, and I guess the maturity assessment fits into the essence of this third issue, and that is, how do we even know whether the information you produce, in other words, the answers which you give, how do we know whether they are good or bad in terms of supporting enterprise value or linked into a risk or opportunity? I mean, quality control will, of course, ensure that the answers meet a certain prerequisite insofar as being clear, understandable, consistent, timely, and so on. But this doesn't really necessarily increase the confidence of an asset owner or asset manager just because you've said it very well. So when you answer question 10 and 11 from the previous slide, which asked you how information reaches management and the frequency of passing this information, you'll maybe talk about a process or capability that that question requires. So, for example, you might talk about a climate engine, or you make it sound good. So you say we've got this super duper climate engine that models physical climate risk exposures, where this model then passes through an AI transformational layer, or dynamically passes through an AI transformational layer that starts to learn the calculations, machine learning, throw it in there, it all sounds great, and I'm sure it is great. There are some fantastic capabilities out there in industry, right? But as an asset owner or an asset manager, they are more keen to understand the maturity in such processes. Hence why you start to have those engagement sessions, right, where they can get more specific. For example, does your super duper climate engine trigger on an ad hoc basis? Or is it even repeatable if someone leaves the organization? I've seen these processes where these modeling engines are essentially just disaggregated spreadsheets hovering in the corner of someone's desktop. Okay, and we need to now know whether this climate engine is this something which has been defined in the organization as part of its official procedures, or is it part of an applications portfolio? And even so, if it is, that's also great. That's a certain level of maturity you've got now. But that doesn't then tell me whether this climate engine uses key performance measures, and whether it can be optimized, and whether you have some kind of protocol for continual improvement. So you can see these various degrees of maturity here. Because every business is in the habit of offering you the brightest part of a potential bad or volatile story, which in turn can have an impact on the confidence in both how you disclose and how your audience interpret your disclosures. So in the next few slides, I want to just touch on how the TCFD have approached this quality control issue, and how they've offered you an approach to setting up effective climate governance. I will then come on to how the TCFD Alignment Maturity Assessment helps bring together the entire picture. So let's look at how the TCFD solve for quality control. Okay, well, to achieve some control in your answers to those probing questions, the TCFD offers fundamental principles of effective disclosures as a means to maintain a level of quality in what you disclose, and of course how you disclose it. So these are seven principles here, which are actually sliced down into detailed level guidance, but I won't be covering this in detail in this presentation. However, at a very high level, the guidance here is to present relevant information, make sure that that information is specific and complete, make sure that that information is balanced and understandable, consistent over time, make it comparable amongst the organizations within the sector, the industry, or in your portfolio. Ensure that the information is reliable, verifiable, and objective. Now, that objective word is very difficult to apply in an organization, especially big organizations. And ensure that it's provided on a timely basis. So these principles essentially give us some quality controls and enable the organization to coordinate and convey the message in a structured manner. Now, the issue here is that each one of these principles then drills down into 2 or 3 levels of detail to essentially start defining terms and tell you what it means to be specific and complete. For example, what do those terms mean? Now, I've seen this in the past where, with other compliance and regulatory initiatives, to the point that in my own personal experience here, it becomes very difficult for senior leadership teams to authentically coordinate all those permutations across a large capitalized multi-franchise global business. Things start to get lost, budgets begin to grow arms and legs, and you start to really force compliance more arbitrarily than effectively. As a stakeholder, I love that your message is clear, but by default, if I have exposures to your business, whether that's supply chain exposures, investment exposures, insurance risk exposures, you need to be sure that I will be plugging your claims into my own proprietary models, my proprietary truth models, right? So that's that around quality control. Okay, now let's look at the issue of setting up climate governance effectively. Now, as previously mentioned, your investigations and the outputs you produce through your investigations, they'll be heavily compromised, and in some instances, totally invalid if you are yet to set up climate governance, or if your climate governance in your organization is ineffective. So luckily, the TCFD have offered us the World Economic Forum's guidance on how to set up effective climate governance on corporate boards. This takes the form of 8 guiding principles. Each one of them is packaged with its own suite of guiding questions. Okay, so let us take a look and just really get a feel of the World Economic Forum's guidance, because I'll be referencing one of their questions leading up to the example of the TCFD Alignment Maturity Assessment. So let's take, for example, we'll take a look at the first 2 principles here to further build out that context. So principle number 1 here refers to climate accountability on boards. And yes, the methodology is actually the same as before to some degree, okay, whereby climate accountability on boards is the instruction, or as we said, it's the required outcome. Okay, in other words, it's like saying we, the Financial Stability Board, want you, the organization, to deliver an outcome whereby you have climate accountability on your board. That's the outcome. Now, unlike before, the TCFD don't then offer a series of required outputs, okay? But they do offer the boundaries through probing questions that we see here again. Okay, so and I should say at this point that as far as the governance pillar is concerned, the World Economic Forum's 8 guiding principles hold the most weight in helping you deliver the disclosures for climate-related governance. Okay, so it's imperative that you are aligned to something like these World Economic Forum principles, and it should be absolutely part of your climate-related sustainable development. And again, can you see the issue where a subjective, opinion-based bias starts to emerge when answering these questions? And maybe you can also see how those principles of effective disclosures, you remember those 7 quality control principles of providing reliable, timely, consistent information, etc. Can you see the challenges in applying those principles to open and closed-ended questions like this? Okay, so let's take a look at, for example, question number 4, where it asks, do your directors feel confident in their abilities to explain their decisions as informed by the best available information on climate risks and opportunities? Okay, now we have a double-edged sword here, right? If you say yes, you need to then strategically inject some rationality behind why you've said yes, and maybe consciously think about some humility there as well to make it sound effective, right? And then if you say no, then that opens up another chain of problems. So let's now use a maturity assessment mindset and see how we take question 4 and frame it with multiple levels of effectiveness. So for example, we're talking about confidence in decisions here, right? So if I was a stakeholder in your business, then I would want to see that your decisions can be optimized to the changing global context for climate change, right? So that's a high level of maturity right there, where your decisions are informed and optimized to the very dynamic nature of climate change, right? And then I guess I would want to know if your decisions are informed by quantitative measures which reference the global context for climate change. Okay, and are these decisions, are they informed by a defined process, something which is proactive and centrally controlled across the organization? And if the informing of these decisions is not managed by a centrally controlled process, will it then be possible to plan for such decision making in a repeatable way, or do you only make informed decisions on a reactive basis, like when, say, new research emerges or an activist group gains some prominence, or of course, mandatory alignment? Okay, and I've seen this, by the way. I've contributed to enterprise risk narratives in reports, and I've seen the very real ad hoc reactive narratives that start to emerge. Okay, so let's move on to another example and build on this context. So as I said, I'm not going to go through all 8 principles here, but we can finish off here on principle number 2. And this principle explores your board's command on the climate change subject. And again, that's the required outcome there. Okay, in other words, the FSB would say, we, the FSB, want you, the board, to achieve an effective grasp on the climate change subject. And that's the outcome, or say part of the outcome required in your journey for setting up effective climate governance. Now, like before, they offer a series of questions for you to then explore and investigate in your organization. And again, we have the same issues insofar as applying that quality control, especially around maintaining objectivity. Okay, so what I want to do now is take one of these questions and show you how I would approach the question in the context of using the TCFD Alignment Maturity Assessment. So please direct your attention to question 7 here. This is essentially the 7th question in the second guiding principle for effective climate governance as designed by the World Economic Forum. This question asks you to disclose information about how your board planned for succession to ensure that the climate awareness does not stop if a key individual or a vocal climate champion leaves the organization or the board. They want you to further disclose the kind of skills that you incorporate into the desired profile for a new board director when they join. As you can see, I've labeled this as Principle 2.7, so please do remember this question about succession planning because I will be going off-road a little now as I introduce you to the TCFD Alignment Maturity, and then we'll lay it out and apply it to this particular question. So please, we will be recalling that in a short while. So you will remember this diagram from earlier on in the presentation, and you'll also see that we went into some depth with regards to those required outputs and required outcomes. And I also demonstrated how probing questions form that boundary and act as a mechanism to delivering those outputs. We then spoke about the quality control and how the TCFD addressed these issues through their principles of effective disclosures, and of course, the previous slide demonstrating the guiding principles for effective climate governance or setting up effective climate governance. And as you know, I didn't go into any such detail with regards to the tools and capabilities, although the maturity assessment works as an assessment tool and overlaps between kind of techniques and tools here. And of course, if we go to frameworks, I didn't go into any such detail with regards to other frameworks and standards because each box here will essentially be just a huge discourse in itself. So let me take your focus back to the probing questions here, okay? Because it is here where the TCFD Alignment Maturity Assessment actually lives. And what we do here is essentially take those probing questions and use them to inform its corresponding validation statement, okay? So let me kind of distill that concept of a validation statement just to get us onto the same page here, okay? So at its very basic level, or very, very basic level, if I ask you a question, where do you park your car at night? Okay, that would be a probing question. Now you could then say, I park at my friend's house, I park at my mum's house, I park on my neighbor's driveway because they're on holiday. You know, you can then really take it where you want if you type an answer. Or you could then select an option. In other words, you select an option which boxes you in to a specific answer. Now the problem here is that although it works pretty well to select an option, it works pretty well, but in this particular example, it begins to get complicated with deeper level questions. So you end up having to pin narratives to support your selection. And we see this necessity to pin narratives with most of the incumbent ESG or sustainability frameworks, reporting frameworks, of course, right? When you select an option, they then give you a box to then support that selection with a narrative, which immediately becomes vulnerable. So let's turn this question into its corresponding validation statement, which says, I park my car in my own garage at night. Okay, agree or disagree. So you could select one of those options. So the framework making such inquiries, or in this case, the car insurance company making such inquiries, by using a validation statement, and by the way, car insurance companies are now doing this, right? This is a real trend out there because they've recognized the limitations on this, so they're now using validation statements, and I've seen this myself. Okay, so by using a validation statement, they can now, by default, gain very, very specific answers, saving you a considerable amount of time as a stakeholder, right? So continuing to keep it simple, this particular example of a validation statement could then increase or decrease in maturity. In other words, increase or decrease in risk. Okay, so let's look at a more riskier statement. What could that say? I park my car on my street at night. Naturally, parking on the street is more riskier than parking in your garage or in your driveway, okay, which is more riskier than parking in an underground car park secured by secured by a police alert or an alarm or something like that. So there are various degrees of risk in these validation statements, and we call those various degrees of maturity. So let's get back to the TCFD. So in the TCFD Alignment Maturity Assessment, we essentially have a full suite of validation statements. We have 5 levels of strength, or call it five levels of maturity here. We actually test you at level 0, okay, to first see if you even qualify to have an assessment. And level 0 is essentially where your activity is non-existent, or in this case, incomplete and ineffective. Level 1 is where you confirm against a statement that tells me that you operate a reactive or ad hoc process with no formal tracking whatsoever. So it's really the lowest level of maturity for an organization working on their TCFD alignment. And don't be surprised that some tier 1 organizations, some large cap organizations will be at this stage for many statements in the assessment. Level 2 is where you confirm against a statement that tells me you manage your climate related development with a level of repeatability. So yes, you can plan and control the Sustainable Development Initiative to a minimum standard. So there are some shortcomings, and those shortcomings do need addressing. Level 3 is where I would expect you to be as a large cap organization. This is where you confirm against a statement that tells me that you have an organization-wide defined process, and you proactively address the issues relating to a particular validation statement. Now, level 4 is where you confirm against a statement that tells me not only have your processes and capabilities been defined across the organization, but you use data-driven insights from quantitative metrics and key performance measures. So I would hope that most tier 1 organizations are hitting this level for all validation statements by around 2024. Or maybe even later, but I would hope that this would be the case for most tier 1 organizations out there. Then you have level 5 maturity, which is where you confirm against a statement that tells me you are continually improving against a particular requirement. The key outcome here is that you are enabled to optimize your position against the dynamic nature of materiality. Now, to prepare the assessment, I have laid out the 5 levels of maturity here in sequential order. So let us now map these 5 levels of maturity onto a particular required outcome, which is to have command on the climate change subject. So the example that I'm going to use is the one about succession planning, which was one of the questions from the second principle of the World Economic Forum's guidance, you might recall, where they required an outcome for having command on the climate change subject. And the required output here was to set up effective succession planning and ensure that climate awareness and knowledge are retained should your climate talent leave the organization. Okay, so here we go. Let's first test this question through a level 0 validation statement. And remember, level 0 isn't really a maturity level, hence why we only have 5 levels of maturity and not 6. Right? Level 0 is really just setting the scene to see if we need to really continue a maturity assessment. So the validation statement here is that the board do not discuss succession plans, and whatever climate awareness exists within the board, it will be lost should that individual leave. Now, many small cap organizations might still be here today, by the way, where a nomination committee may not have considered the climate-led talent required to manage the incoming disclosure regulations. Now, if a board committee can demonstrate that they have and they do consider succession planning in the context of climate talent, then we move on to test the organization at level 1. And at level 1, we're saying that the board discusses or has discussed succession plans with a hope that climate awareness does not stop if a key individual or a vocal climate champion leaves the organization or the board. The board demonstrate that it has skills or competencies matrix or something similar only when they need to address the requirements to develop a profile for a new board director, and that this matrix is quite reactive and it's completed on an ad hoc basis to really just brush off those key risks associated with a skills and competencies gap, right? But an important thing here is bullet point number 3, where we're saying the organization still recognize the importance to have a process that meets a minimum specified standard, at least, in addressing skills and competencies gaps, and it plans to create a more manageable process to close those succession risks. Now, we could see here that this is a lower level of maturity here, right? As the board are currently quite reactive to the demands of climate-related succession planning with no formal tracking or no repeatable processes which can be planned against. So now there are 2 options here, okay? You can either agree with this statement, and if you disagree, as you can see in this case, they selected to test the next level up. So let's do just this and test them against maturity level 2. Over here then, the board can demonstrate tactical approaches, right, to plan for succession to address the issues of climate awareness stopping if a key individual or a vocal climate champion leaves the organization or the board. And similarly, the board can demonstrate that skills and competencies matrix or something similar to help develop that new board director. But what we're saying in this level of maturity is that the matrix is controlled through a minimum specified standard and has a strong element of repeatability, and the skills competencies gaps are updated regularly. Okay, and again, the 3rd bullet point here is quite important because we're showing the ambitions of the organization as they plan to eventually make this process into a defined process across the organization with proactive resources assigned to monitor and update the key skills and competencies gaps, right? So once again, it's now really about the skills and competencies matrix having effective use value to enable that retention of climate talent. Assume now the board disagree once again, and they believe that this level is too low. We then go ahead and test the next level up, which is maturity level 3. Now over here in level 3, the board can demonstrate a succession strategy. Okay, this is the first time that a succession plan falls within a defined process, okay, where that matrix has been defined across the organization and is proactively monitored. However, there are limitations in that there are no quantitative measures driving the information gaps on talent. Hence, there is a lower level of predictability in terms of how effectively that climate talent has been preserved within the organization. And once again, we'll test the next level up here. The next level up here will be level 4, where again, like level 3, succession planning falls within the strategic dimension rather than a tactical dimension, or of course, just hoping for the best like we saw in level 1. Okay, now at this level, level 4, the organization is reliant upon quantitative performance measures to drive that information about the talent gaps in climate awareness. There is, of course, a high level of predictability and confidence in your disclosures about your strategy to preserve the most current climate awareness and how you ensure the board's profiles are maintained with the most up-to-date climate-related information. And of course, with that quantitative data, you can now monitor performance measures, which will ensure that the successes are embedded into the processes and that climate talent knowledge gaps are filled with greater effect. And finally, level 5. Level 5 maturity is distinguished by the fact that it has an active living status, right? And in this instance, it demonstrates how you continually improve and have an ability to optimize your succession planning processes to the dynamic nature of climate-related information. And in this case, climate talent can be seamlessly embedded to the process to ensure that climate talent knowledge gaps are filled with maximum effect. So yes, it's a small increment from level 4, but it's a necessary increment because level 5 is about your capability to operate at peak performance, whereby you are enabled for preservation, resilience, and continuity, etc. And confirming against the level 5 maturity statement, it will tell me that you are now built to withstand the increasingly volatile global context for climate change, and yet still retain the DNA of your organization. And that's an important point, right? Retaining the DNA of your organization where you're not going to compromise on your brand IP or your strategy just because you need to fit into the requirements of a standard. So let's wrap this up. So I've walked you through just one example of the type of statements that we'll use in this assessment, and there are currently over 300 developed statements like this in the governance element alone. So, and I'm also on target for about 750 statements across all 4 pillars of the TCFD's framework. And you can find other examples of these statements on the website at sustainablefactors.com/insights. And of course, you can contact me through the website if you wish to start working through an assessment in your organization. The scoring methodology is weighted at 100% for each element, so there is no cross-contamination of a possible low maturity score in one element then infecting or impacting a higher score in another element of the TCFD framework. So to conclude, taking the TCFD Alignment Maturity Assessment will help you with effective TCFD alignment, of course, precision in your overall TCFD strategy. It's going to really empower the climate thinking across the organization and build a stronger coalition with that direct, precise focus on the strategic pathway. It will, and sustainable architecture is a bigger subject in itself, but it's going to add and contribute to the reporting element of your sustainable architecture. And of course, finally, most importantly, it's going to help you disclose with absolute confidence. I would like to take this opportunity now to thank you for watching this presentation if you've come this far. And once again, do not hesitate to contact me should you wish to engage further.